Android built its reputation on being the open alternative. While Apple controlled every aspect of what you could install on an iPhone, Android let you install software from anywhere, not just from the Play Store, from websites, from other app stores, from files shared directly between devices, from developers who never asked anyone's permission to distribute their work. This openness was not just a feature. It was the identity. It was the reason millions of developers chose Android, the reason privacy advocates trusted it, the reason open source communities built entire ecosystems around it, the reason that when you bought an Android phone, it felt like it actually belonged to you. On September 30th, 2026, that changes. Google is rolling out a developer verification policy that requires any developer whose app is easily installable outside the Play Store to first verify their real identity with Google. Not just a username, not just an email address, real identity, legal name, government ID, the works. The rollout begins in Brazil, Indonesia, Singapore, and Thailand. In 2027, it expands globally. And before anyone says this only affects a small technical minority who sideload apps, this policy applies to certified Android devices, which means more than 95% of Android phones sold outside China. This is not a niche change. This is Android's operating system being restructured at the foundational level to work differently than it has ever worked before. Let me explain what is actually happening, why Google says it is doing this, why critics are calling it the end of Android as a genuinely open platform, and what you can still do about it. What the policy actually does, the mechanism is simpler to understand than the corporate language surrounding it suggests. Currently, installing an app from outside the Play Store on an Android phone requires you to enable a permission called Install Unknown Apps for the source you are installing from, confirm a security warning, and proceed. It is not frictionless, but it is not particularly difficult either. Millions of people do it regularly for legitimate reasons. Under the new policy, when you attempt to install an app through a certified app store that is not the Play Store, the store will check whether the app's developer has completed Google's identity verification process. If they have, the installation proceeds normally. If they have not, the installation is blocked or routed through a separate path called the advanced flow. The advanced flow is specifically designed to be difficult. It requires enabling developer mode, which is buried in settings, and requires a non-obvious unlock sequence. It requires a device restart. It involves a waiting period before the installation is permitted. Google has stated explicitly in its internal documentation that the friction in the advanced flow is intentional. The slowness is a feature, not a bug. For apps installed entirely outside any store, directly from APK files, ADB sideloading from a computer still works for users with sufficient technical knowledge. This is Google's concession to the deeply technical user who understands what they are doing. But the pathway is narrow, inconvenient, and not accessible to casual users. The result is a system where anonymous or unverified developer apps cannot be easily installed by ordinary users on standard Android phones, full stop. Google's arguments and why they are not entirely wrong. Google's stated justifications for this policy deserve honest evaluation, because dismissing them entirely would be intellectually dishonest. The malware argument is supported by real numbers. Google has cited research indicating that apps installed from outside the Play Store carry approximately 50 times the malware risk of Play Store apps. This figure comes from internal analysis of malware infections on Android devices, and while the specific number should be viewed with appropriate skepticism given its source, the directional claim is consistent with independent security research. Apps distributed outside the Play Store do not go through the review process that catches a significant portion of malicious software before it reaches users. The fraud accountability argument reflects a real problem. Scammers who use fake apps to steal from victims have historically been able to create new developer accounts, almost immediately after previous accounts are banned. Each new account comes with a new identity, a new email address, a new starting point. If developer accounts are tied to verified real identities, and those identities are linked to the resulting bans, creating a new account after being banned becomes significantly harder. The coercion resistance argument is the most specific and least obvious. A common fraud pattern involves criminals calling victims while pretending to be bank support staff or government officials, convincing them over the phone to install a malicious app immediately, creating urgency and pressure that prevents the victim from thinking critically. The intentional slowness of the advanced flow is designed to interrupt this pattern. If the installation process requires multiple steps, a restart, and a waiting period, a fraudster cannot rush a victim through it in a single phone call. These are real problems. Google is not inventing them. And the policy, if it works as intended, would genuinely address them to some degree. The question is what is sacrificed to achieve these goals, and whether the sacrifice is proportionate. What is actually being sacrificed? The most significant cost of this policy is the death of anonymous software distribution on Android. Consider who benefits from anonymous software development and distribution on an open platform. Activists in authoritarian countries who build tools to circumvent censorship, communicate securely with journalists, or organize political opposition cannot verify their identity with a major American corporation without exposing themselves to retaliation. Their ability to distribute software anonymously to the people who need it depends on Android's historical openness. Under the new policy, software they build cannot be easily installed by ordinary users, without them first handing their real identity to Google. Privacy tool developers who build applications that protect users from surveillance, including surveillance by corporations and governments, often choose not to associate their real identities with their work. The irony of a policy requiring identity verification from developers of privacy tools is significant and not lost on the communities that depend on them. Hobbyist and student developers who build apps for learning, for small communities, or for personal use operate in a space where the overhead of formal developer verification creates a barrier that many will not clear. Google's acknowledgement of this problem led to the creation of a limited distribution account option that allows installation on up to 20 devices without full verification. 20 devices. If you build something useful that spreads through your friend group or community, 20 devices is not a workable limit. Open source projects distributed through platforms like F-Droid exist specifically to provide an alternative to the identity-gated, commerce-oriented Play Store ecosystem. F-Droid's entire catalog represents the work of developers who chose to distribute through a channel that respects their autonomy and their users' freedom. The verification requirement, applied at the App Store level, creates new friction for this ecosystem that did not exist before, and that serves no legitimate security purpose for software that is already open source and independently auditable. The centralized control point this creates is also worth naming directly. When the easy installation of software on Android requires approval from a single American corporation, that corporation becomes a choke point through which governments can apply pressure. A government that wants a particular political app removed from Android phones has a new and more effective lever. Pressure Google to revoke or refuse verification for the app's developer. Previously, an app that was removed from the Play Store could still be distributed as an APK. Under the new policy, distribution outside the Play Store to ordinary users requires verification that Google controls. This is not a hypothetical concern. Governments have repeatedly pressured platform operators to remove political content, and platform operators have repeatedly complied with some of those requests. The walled garden Android spent 20 years. Criticizing the historical irony of this moment in Android's development is worth dwelling on. Apple's App Store model, when it launched in 2008, was criticized extensively by the Android community for exactly the control it exercised. Every application required Apple's approval. Developers who built software that competed with Apple's own products were routinely rejected. Content that Apple found objectionable was blocked. The entire ecosystem ran through a single corporate gatekeeper whose decisions were final and not subject to appeal. Android positioned itself explicitly against this model. The openness to install software from any source was not an accident or an oversight. It was a design choice and a marketing differentiator. Android phone advertisements emphasized freedom. Android developer documentation celebrated the platform's openness. Android advocacy materials contrasted favorably with the walled garden that iOS represented. The developer verification policy does not make Android identical to iOS. Sideloading is not banned. ADB installation still works. Developer mode still exists. The garden, if we extend the metaphor, still has a gate that technically savvy users can find and open. But it has a gate now. A gate that requires verification from Google to open easily. A gate that ordinary users will encounter and most will not pass. Not because they cannot, but because the friction is designed to discourage them. The effect on casual users, who occasionally sideloaded apps for legitimate reasons, is straightforward. They will encounter the block, they will not know about ADB, they will not bother with the developer mode. And waiting periods. They will go back to the Play Store or go without the app. The friction works. Android is becoming a different platform than it was. Not all at once, not through a single dramatic announcement. Through the gradual accumulation of friction on the paths that lead away from Google's control. What you can still do. The policy is not the end of every alternative pathway on Android, but the alternatives that remain require increasingly technical knowledge. ADB sideloading, which uses Android Debug Bridge to install applications directly from a computer, remains functional and is not subject to the developer verification system in the same way. If you have a computer, a USB cable, and the willingness to learn a command line tool, you can still install software from any source on your Android device. This pathway will remain accessible for technically capable users, and this is not a small group, but it is a significantly smaller group than the millions who have historically used simpler sideloading methods. The advanced flow, frustrating by design, remains available as the official non-ADB pathway for unverified software. For someone determined enough to navigate developer mode, the restart requirement, and the waiting period, the option exists. Treating this as a meaningful provision for ordinary users requires ignoring what Google itself has said about why it was designed to be slow. Graphene OS and similar de-Googled Android distributions represent a more complete escape from the verification system. Graphene OS is not a certified Android device in Google's sense, and the developer verification system is a feature of certified Android. Devices running alternative Android distributions operate outside this framework entirely. The European Union dimension is worth watching. EU regulations, including the Digital Markets Act, require that Apple allow alternative app stores in sideloading, specifically because regulators identified the gatekeeper position of platform operators as an antitrust concern. If the Android developer verification policy is applied to EU markets in the same form as the global rollout, it may face regulatory scrutiny similar to what Apple has faced. Public pressure has already had an effect. The policy that is actually being implemented is a modified version of an earlier, more restrictive proposal that would have allowed no opt-out at all. The current policy, with its advanced flow, alternative, and limited distribution account option, represents concessions that came in response to feedback from developer communities and open source advocates. The channel for that pressure to continue working is not closed. Android has changed. Not completely, not irrevocably, not in every direction simultaneously. But the change is real and the direction is clear. The platform that built its identity on openness, that spent 20 years differentiating itself from Apple's model of centralized control, is implementing a form of centralized control over software distribution that most Android users a decade ago would not have recognized as compatible with Android's values. The security justifications are real, the fraud problem is real, the malware risk from unverified sources is real, the cost is also real. Anonymous software distribution is ending on mainstream Android. Open source ecosystems face new friction. Developers in authoritarian contexts face new risks. The single corporate gatekeeper that Android was built as an alternative to has become the gatekeeper of Android itself. Whether the trade-off is worth it depends on what you value about a mobile platform. If you value convenience and security against the most common threats, the new Android serves you reasonably well. If you value the freedom to install what you choose, from whom you choose, without asking Google's permission, the Android that offered that is becoming harder to access. Make noise. Support open source alternatives. Learn ADB if you have not. Know your options. And remember that the version of this policy that is being implemented was less restrictive than the one that was originally proposed. That difference happened because people objected loudly enough that Google listened. That avenue has not closed yet.